IB Biology Topic 5 curriculum focuses on evolution. In this video specifically, we will be looking at the current evidence we have for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Before we begin, I want to talk about the picture we have here on this first slide. More often than not, this image pops into my mind when I hear the word evolution, and I am sure other people think about it as well. Unfortunately, this image is a drastically incorrect view of evolution. But why? If we look at this image, it only shows a one-directional path that evolution took to get from point A to point B. Additionally, this could also mean that each organism somehow turned into each subsequent organism, meaning that these earlier species no longer exist. Throughout this unit, we will challenge these ideas and this picture specifically to frame the correct view of evolution that biologists study today. So, where do we begin? Let's start with the definition. Evolution occurs when heritable characteristics of a species change. While this seems pretty simple, it's a bit more complex than you think. In order for phenotypic characteristics to change, we have to consider their genes, or their genotype, as the location where changes occur. These genetic changes are what causes different phenotypic expressions in organisms over time. Additionally, we know that individual organisms do not evolve. So, we need to look at evolution on the level of a population changing rather than just one individual. As shown in the picture, the population of beetles is becoming lighter colored over time because the green beetles are being selectively eaten by the bird based on the environment that they live in. We'll break this scenario down a little bit more in 5.2, but for now, let's stay focused on 5.1. While discussing the theory of evolution, or the change in allele frequencies over generational time, we must have evidence to support our claims. The fossil record provides evidence for evolution by examining changes in extinct organisms and comparing them to present-day phenotypes. One very famous and common example of this is the dino bird named Archaeopteryx. Scientists originally thought that birds evolved from dinosaurs, but lacked little hard evidence to show a connecting relationship. In 1861, German paleontologist Hermann von Meyer discovered the first fossil of an organism that showed a transitional state from dinosaur to bird. This organism had qualities of both reptiles and common-day birds. Like reptiles, it had teeth and a long bony tail, and like modern birds, it had feathered wings. Because of these features, scientists use this as a transitional fossil, because it shows and helps explain the idea that common birds evolved from a reptilian ancestor. Another type of evidence for evolution can be seen through selective breeding. With modern agriculture, humans have been selectively breeding organisms for thousands of generations. Over that time, they have chosen specific traits to be bred and passed along to the next generation of offspring. This in turn changes the allele frequencies of populations over time, but not in a natural way. Human selective breeding, as seen in this picture, generates desired phenotypes that benefit humans, often at the expense of the organism. This chicken, for example, has changed dramatically since its 1957 ancestor in both height and mass, meaning that farmers can produce more meat per chicken for human consumption. This genetic change over time, through many generations, is proof that evolution is at play, even if it is artificially created by humans. Next up, comparative anatomy also provides evidence for evolution. When comparing structures of organisms, scientists look for both similarities and differences to try and predict evolutionary relationships. In this example, the human, bat, porpoise, frog, and horse limbs all have similar bone structures, which are color coordinated in the diagram. Even though the limbs have different functions based on the animal, all of the bone structures are very similar. This phenomenon defines the structures as being homologous, and it infers that these organisms share a common ancestor. Speciation also provides evidence for evolution, as it describes how one species can, over time, evolve into two separate species. There are many mechanisms that can cause this to happen, but the main idea is that a population becomes isolated over long periods of time. When this happens, the isolated groups will eventually become two separate species that originated from a common ancestor. Look at the example in this image. The initial species shows a population of beetles that contain light and dark variations. Let's say that this population was separated geographically by a river that was formed after a massive storm that changed the landscape. The beetles cannot cross the river, and the environments on each side were drastically different after the storm. On the north side of the river there were darker trees and woodlands, and on the south side of the river there were lighter prairies. Over thousands of generations, through natural selection, the genotypes and phenotypes of these organisms changed, and the best suited organisms survived. Years later, when the river dried up, these organisms could contact each other again, but after all of the changes over such a long period of time, they would no longer reproduce with one another, meaning that they were two separate species. While this is a fictional example, the idea of species separating and adapting through natural selection is what drives speciation. One very common and well-known example of evolution can be studied through the case of the melanistic moths. Originally, these moths were light-colored, which allowed them to blend into their environment on these light-colored trees to hide from predators. During the Industrial Revolution, and with an increase in factories, there were massive amounts of pollution that was put into the environment that these moths lived in. Over time, the airborne pollution coated the trees near the factories, making them darker. Due to a mutation, there was a small number of dark-colored moths that usually had a low chance of survival because of their inability to hide from predators. With the trees coated a darker shade, these dark moths now had an advantage over the light-colored moths because they could blend in. This caused a massive change in moth color over generations as more dark moths were surviving and reproducing, while lighter moths were being eaten. This change over time based on selective pressures is how natural selection works, and provides a great example of evolutionary change within a population.